Airing first on Asheville FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcast and podcast emanating out of occupied Tsalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices from struggles for liberation from all around the world. This week we spoke with Honor, a member of the Horn Anarchists, an anarchist group based in East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia and among the Ethiopian diaspora. The group has been around for about a year and hopes to organize and spread anarchist ideas and organizing in the Horn of Africa. They also plan to work with refugees in Sudan from the recent displacement in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. For the hour, Honor talks about that group, the history of post-Junta Ethiopia, the context of the ongoing armed conflict in Tigray, the fighting factions and the displacement and violence suffered by residents of the region, as well as the ethnic hatred against Tigrayans by the government of Abi Ahmed and the Prosperity Party. You can hear more perspectives from Horn Anarchists by checking out @Horn Anarchists on Twitter or by visiting their website, hornanarchists.noblogs.org, which is mostly in Amharic and Tigrayan, but readable in English via online translation services. But first, some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a what?
Recently, someone told me about the existence of a group out there in the world that refers to itself as incel. It's a collection of men, mostly straight white men, who are involuntary celibate. That is, they are not sexually active, but not by choice. They want to be. But no one, it seems, wants to be sexually active with them. But incel's more than that. Back before I got locked up, in my own life experience, I would go for stretches without someone in my life with whom I was creating genital friction. It happens. Since getting locked up, I've gone a stretch of almost 30 years where I've been without someone in my life whom I can create genital friction. But incel is more than that. Incel is a thing where men who are involuntarily celibate develop a philosophy, a kind of worldview to which they all ascribe. One where they place blame on others for their inability to find a willing sexual partner. So yeah, just with that, there's a lot to unpack. First, observation. It seems that incels are under the delusion that they have the right to a sexual partner, that they're entitled to genital friction, that someone else has an obligation to put that incel's unused erections to good use, or fair use, or very unsatisfying use, as the cause may be. Also, part of that delusion is that incels' confusion that a sex partner is a thing to have, like property, like you acquire a sex partner in the same general manner that you acquire a coffee table from IKEA. And so perhaps we arrive somewhat at the incel's major malfunction, that underlying cause, at least partially, of why their sex lives are so solitary. Likely, their very approach to encountering potential partners reflects their understanding of others as a more use objects. Let's not forget that most genital friction between two consenting people is preceded by encounters with clothes on, a meeting, a first impression, chit-chat, some degree of self-revelation. The sharing of who we are, the experience of time together. I can't imagine that an incel who feels entitled to the copulation and thinks of potential partners as a collection of meat around the parking space where he wants to put his erection will be very satisfying to anyone participating in social conventions of getting to know one another. What I mean is, you can't approach the process of finding a partner like you're one of those bozos from Night at the Roxbury. Approaching possible mates with an ambush of pelvic thrusting. It just doesn't work that way. So, perhaps this also reveals another aspect of incel's major malfunction. They resent the absence of genital friction, but not interaction with someone significant. What I mean is, they're only mad about the lack of opportunity for intercourse, not at the absence of time with someone they care about, eating together, laughing, watching TV while cuddling on the couch. Talking, interacting. The propriety is an activity, not wearing pants. Not to knock activities with the absence of pants, there are other components to human mating relationships, and it seems that incels don't care about those. They don't want them, don't miss them. They're not interested in healthy human relationships and making someone else happy. No wonder why they can't get laid. This is a really dangerous development. Incels just aren't pitiful, sniveling Quasimodos, bewailing their relegation to ringing the bells in the church towers and masturbating to internet porn. There's something more than that. There's social identity that blames women and hates women for women's failure to be available to incels as objects to please them. Very misogynist. The implicit logic of their position is that women have deprived them of their natural entitlement, have failed to serve them in the way that they are owed. And so, the responsible conclusion for their argument, while maybe not stated outright, is that rape is an understandable response. In this way, the incel identity and philosophy is a promotion of rape culture, the reduction of women to products and services to which men are entitled. With such a charming outlook, I can't imagine why women aren't flocking around to these guys. It's just perplexable. Yeah, that's sarcasm. But that's the thing, right? They really don't see it. They can't figure out why they're not the prizes they think they are. Their moms told them how wonderful they were, and they believe them. Newsflash, incels. Everyone's mom tells them how great they are. So a bit of advice for incels. Maybe you should work on you. Learn to care about someone or something other than yourself. Maybe get a puppy or a kitten, or maybe start with a goldfish and try not to kill it. Then progress to more complex life forms. Maybe reorient your approach to humans and imagine them to have thoughts and feelings and experiences that are valid to them, just as you have. If you develop some empathy and some social skills, maybe your fortunes will deservingly change, along with your habits. This is nays, which isn't Sean Swain spelled backwards. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain by addressing letters to Sean Swain, number 201 5638, Buckingham Correctional Center, P.O. Box 630, Dillwyn, Virginia 23936. He has a book that is available from Little Black Cart Distro. His zines can be found online at theanarchistlibrary.org, and other of his writings and updates are still available at swainrocks.org. Sean has a complaint pending before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission for the torture that he suffered at the hands of the state of Ohio. He is also collecting letters of support for his bid for clemency. You can find more details on Instagram by following Swainiac1969. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks. Would you please introduce yourself, if you'd like, and tell us a bit about Horn Anarchists as a collective project?
I go by the name Anna, and I use she, her pronouns. Horn Anarchists as a collective project started about a year ago with the aim of disseminating anarchist ideas and values in the politics of the Horn. Individually, we were engaged in different anti-fascist, feminist, labor, and refugee solidarity organizing, and we later came together to bring the values of anarchism and some of our works into a shared collective organizing. Most of what we've been doing in the past year has been online, since some of our members are in the diaspora, some of us are based in the Horn of Africa, and we haven't actually been able to come together as of yet and work into grassroots projects as of yet, but we have hopes of doing that recently. With what is happening in Tigray and the crisis, we plan to meet in Sudan to do some refugee solidarity work in Sudan for those that have been forced to flee their homes because of the genocidal war.
A set vision of anarchism that unites folks, or is it just a set of common values? And if you could sort of describe what those are.
As a collective, the values we really uphold are those of equality, kindness, mutual aid, solidarity, and volunteerism. Especially, some of us were radicalized through the different volunteer activities we've been doing. Some of us were radicalized from reading, quote-unquote, too much of anarchist literature, while others were radicalized by joining different organizing circles. But yeah, those are basically some of the values we all share and uphold.
Can you talk a bit about the milieu or the movement of anarchism in the Horn of Africa, and maybe if it relates to economic, more so, or religious or irreligious ideas, musical or subcultural genres like metal and punk are a big thing in a lot of parts of the world around anarchist communities?
Yeah, you're definitely right about that. Well, when we came together to form Horn Anarchists, one of the things we wanted to do was we wanted to study anarchism in the third world, quote unquote. Most of the anarchist literature we've been studying has been very Eurocentric, so we wanted to understand how the history of anarchism worked in our part of the world. And we haven't had much luck in that regard. The anarchist movements or any anarchist presence we could find were in a very few places. There were some in Nigeria, South Africa, yeah, definitely South Africa, Algeria, a little in Sudan and Egypt, but not a lot, especially not in the Horn. And one of the things we attribute to that is that the settlers in this part of Africa, and especially the highlands of the Horn, are very hierarchical societies that are very religious as well. The two most dominant religions are Orthodox Christianity and Islam, and both are very devout to their religion, and that has maintained a very strong hierarchical community that has been passing down to generations. And the religion has also been highly tied with the state, and people that love their religion, people that love their God, also had to love the state. So anarchism has not really been welcome in our part of the world. The way anarchism came in the Horn, especially in Ethiopia and Eritrea, has a very interesting aspect to it, as it did not come as a movement of its own, recognized and clearly differentiated between other movements. It actually, the way it comes up in the history, it is when Marxist-Leninists and other communist movements, communist organizations, use it to label each other to indicate that the other was less desirable than they were. They wanted to build a strong state, though a communist state, and calling the other anarchist was a way to make sure that the public loses trust and it looks at them with animosity, hostility. It was a way to smear each other's name, basically. And that's how anarchism has been used. Not anarchism per se, but the word anarchist and as a label.
Right now, we're speaking in the aftermath of a police, quote-unquote, police action against the northern province of Tigray. And please correct me if I misstate any of this, but conducted by the Central Ethiopian military that has left widespread displacement. It's been engaged from at least 2 other countries, plus regional and ethnic militia. Widespread reports of theft and sexual assault against people in Tigray. If it's not too much, would you mind giving us like a rundown or a thumbnail sketch of the civil war and its aftermath, and sort of lay the playing field for what's going on right now?
So, just to give you a rundown of the history to understand how we got here, Ethiopia boasts of having had an empire-building history that dates back to 3,000 years ago. And what has been central in the empire-building and state-building process has been a claimed ancestry from the biblical King Solomon, in which different kings and queens claimed they were descendants of King Solomon and hence had a divine right to rule. So this Solomonic dynasty has been one of the strongest forces operating in the region until the 1974 revolution, in which the last monarch was overthrown in a coup d'etat, and a communist state was established by a military junta that took power from the last king. And this communist military junta created a very oppressive, dictatorial, and violent state and started a Red Terror campaign against other leftist groups that were functioning in the country at the time. By this time, there were quite a number of rebel groups, guerrilla fighters, and the TPLF was one of the guerrilla fighters, along with the Eritrean People Liberation Front, Oromo Liberation Front, and many, many other. The military junta was later defeated by a coalition of these guerrilla fighters under the name the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People Revolutionary Democratic Front, which was going to lead the country for the next 30 years. And the TPLF was one of the central and dominant members of this coalition.
Would you talk a little bit about the TPLF? I think in a past article on the blog for the Indigenous Anarchist Federation, your collective described them as a Marxist-Leninist group. Can you talk a bit about them, like what their relationship is to the people in Tigray, and what part they've played in this recent upsurge of conflict with the central Ethiopian regime of Abi Ahmed?
TPLF has a very interesting history. As an organization, it started with 12 people, and it later became the largest armed struggle in the country. The relationship it has with the state has also been very dynamic, as it first started as a rebel group against the regime, and it would later be in power. But before that, it would craft its manifesto and its program as a political party and as an armed rebel group with the aim of self-administration, one, or self-determination, or even independence if unity does not seem to be feasible within the country. This is what later led to the ethnic federalism and then Article 39, which is the most contested article in the Constitution. That is the article that gives nations the right to secession when unity is not possible. With the people of Tigray, the TPLF had a very changing relationship. At first, it was very loved and adored by the community. It was hosted by the communities when it was a rebel, a guerrilla fighter. And then it took power, and then it became an instrument of the state. And the violence that is inherent to the state continued within the TPLF/EPRDF. The EPRDF, to remind you, is the coalition that was led by the TPLF. And the violence of the state and the violence of the party could not be told apart. And then this started to rough things up with the people that used to adore the TPLF and admire their commitment, dedication, and discipline. The TPLF was used as an example of courage, discipline, and dedication. But after it got power, after they got into office, and then continued the violence, sustained the violence of the state, the relationship was somehow changing with the rest of the Ethiopian state as well as the people of Tigray.
This is The Final Straw, and you're hearing our conversation with Honor, a member of Horn Anarchists, based in Ethiopia, talking about the war in the Tigray region of that country.
When Abi Ahmed came to power 3 years back, that is when the TPLF had a chance to revisit their relationship with the people of Tigray. They resigned from their posts at the federal government and went back, members of the TPLF went back to the region of Tigray and started looking back at what they've been doing in the past years and apologized to the people for not having represented them enough, for not having done much good in the past 27 years. At this point, the people of Tigray did not really have an option. I personally think it was a siege, as roads to Tigray were blocked by the Fano Vigilante group from Amhara region, and there was very, very concerning hate preaching that was done, state-sponsored hate preaching that was done against Tigrinya-speaking people. Tigrinya is the official language that people in Tigray speak. They were not labeled as ethnic Tigrayans, but state propaganda machines used the phrase Tigrinya-speaking to tell of atrocities that has been done by the state apparatus in the past 30 years. Abi was applauded to be a reformer, a Democrat, and a neoliberal force in the region. And in his attempt to prove this, he was making sure to document different documentaries that were run on state-owned media, which were basically exposing the violence of the state, and especially how prisoners were treated, how there were prisons that were not even official, underground prisons, garage prisons, and all that sort of thing. Very atrocious stuff that was happening. And the accountability was given to the TPLF. The TPLF was expected to be accountable to all these atrocities that happened all over the country, although the TPLF was only one part of the coalition that was running the country, the EPRDF. It was just one member of the EPRDF. The other members of the EPRDF were still in power. They still held office, but later they changed their name from EPRDF and made it Prosperity Party, which is the party that's now in power, the PP. The PP is a very sharp contrast when seen from the EPRDF, as it is almost a one-man party, where Abi is the chairman and the leader. And the party basically reflects what Abi as a person is. Very narcissistic, authoritarian, aiming to control everything that goes around. That is one of the threats that many people felt. It was a threat to the ethnic federalism and the self-determination of different ethnic regions in the country. The war against Tigray right now, one aspect of it is this ideological difference. The ideological difference between a unitarist state, that is Abi, the one that is led by Abi, that wants to control everything, that wants to assign regional presidents from the center, and then the resistance from a party like the TPLF. The TPLF was a very strong party. It has been in power for 30 years, and it has a well-built structure. It's very dominant in the region. It controls the region and has almost all of the seats within the regional council. And it was a force that could contend the central government, perhaps the only regional force that could contend Abi and the federal government, as all of the others were under Abi's wing, and he could assign any person to be the president of any region. And the people would not have a chance to either elect them or even have a say in who is elected to administer their regional state. That's one of the aspects of the ideological side of the war, of the self-administration, autonomy, versus unitarism and unitary dictatorship.
What sparked the attack on the ENDF by the TPLF forces?
Depending on who you ask, the war on Tigray had different causes. One is the one I had already mentioned. The strength of TPLF was a threat to Abi, that Abi, as a person that wants to silence and criminalize dissent, would naturally be against a region that is powerful enough to contend what he is saying and have consequences. One of the ways this has been seen is with the election that the Tigray region held, despite despite the federal government, deciding to postpone the election using COVID-19 as a pretext. Tigray region had established their own electoral board and managed to have local elections, in a way that took the pandemic seriously. They made sure people kept their social distance, and they took the necessary measures, but made sure the elections happened. And that is perhaps one of the strongest measures taken by the TPLF that made Abi very unhappy. The other one, especially the ones that the state mentions, is the attack on the ENDF by the TPLF forces. We don't know how true this is. Regardless, there are claims that after opposed threats, TPLF allied forces attacked the northern command of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, which resulted in a full-blown war.
Is the communication blockade limited, or has it been limited to Tigray? Is it still ongoing?
So the ENDF, under the Prosperity Party, reacted very violently. It made sure to cut all sorts of communication in Tigray, including telecom, internet, phone line services, electricity, and even water services were cut down. The entire region was in a complete blackouts. We could not get what was happening. We had family there. We could not hear from our families for months. And there was a complete media blackout as well. And the ENDF was going wild in the dark without needing to think about consequences, believing that, I don't know, maybe word would not get out.
So thank you for that. You mentioned that Abi Ahmed has gotten a lot of credit internationally. I think he got a Nobel Peace Prize, for whatever that's worth, for signing this treaty with Eritrea. And since the conflict has escalated, there have been reports of incursions by military troops from Somalia and from Eritrea, and also conflicts between the Ethiopian government and I think the government in Sudan, where a lot of people were fleeing violence in Tigray, or fleeing displacement, if that's a thing. Can you talk a little bit about the way that the borders sort of play into this crisis and the way that other international actors are taking part?
Neighboring nations like Sudan have responded interestingly. Sudan has been hosting refugees that were displaced because of the war. It has hosted more than 60,000 refugees. The numbers would have increased if the borders were not blocked by the Ethiopian National Defense Force. On the contrary, Eritrea has been involved in this war in a very violent manner. The TPLF and the Eritrean People Liberation Front used to be allies during the Derg regime when they were both guerrilla fighters. And then the Eritrea seceded and the Ethio-Eritrea war happened, and there was animosity that lasted for almost 3 decades. And bringing peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea was one of the main reasons Abiy was nominated and later got the Nobel Peace Prize. But this peace process with Eritrea has never included the major warring parties, which was the TPLF, and it was a peace deal between Abiy and the dictator Isaias Afewerki. Members of the media were not told what the peace deal meant and what it constitutes, and in retrospect, it seemed more like a war deal, a genocidal war deal, than a peace process, as a genuine peace process would have first and foremost involved the major belligerent parties, which this peace deal did not. And maybe the whole point of trying to make peace with Eritrea was to eliminate TPLF.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
We will never, ever surrender or compromise. We occupied government buildings, we blockaded highways, and we talked about not just marching, but direct action to shut this shit down.
Here we draw the line. Right here we say no more.
Yate, we invite you to join us for Indigenous Action, a podcast where we dig deep into critical issues impacting our communities in the occupied lands known as the so-called United States, or what many people recognize as Turtle Island.
This is an autonomous, anti-colonial broadcast with unapologetic and claws-out analysis towards total liberation.
So take your seat by this fire, and may the bridges we burn together light our way.
Fuel that fire so it's a blazing fire that they can never stop.
Find us at indigenousaction.org and with the Channel Zero network.
This is The Final Straw, and you're hearing our conversation with Honor, a member of Horn Anarchists, based in Ethiopia, talking about the war in the Tigray region of that country. There have been reports of massacres at, among other places, Mai Kadra, of 600 civilians, mostly ethnic Amharans, and Wakates. It's been accused that the atrocity was conducted by TPLF's sympathetic militia and police. This is one example where it's considered to have been conducted by people from one side, and yet there have been also attacks and massacres that have been reported by Amharans against Tigrayans, as well as all of these reports that are coming out through Human Rights Watch and other organizations about assaults by uniformed military. It's a hard subject, but can you talk about, I guess, some of the things that you want the international audience to know about what you've heard about what's going on? And could you read it as a sign of a wider breakdown of the multi-ethnic communities of the country?
The media blackout had really influenced the international response to the war. For first few months of the war, only the Tigray regional state media was accessible, and that was also state propaganda, and then there was the federal state propaganda from here, but there was no way to actually know what regular people were going through. They were both just spreading propaganda and not reporting what was happening on the ground. The first atrocities we started hearing were from refugees that managed to make it to Sudan. They would tell what they've seen, what they've passed through, and the horrors of the war. Although Abi even went to Parliament to discredit these reports by saying that these refugees were murderers and that they were youth organized by the TPLF he basically labeled them a killing squad and tried to make them lose credit as well as their accounts. But international media was talking to refugees that made it to Sudan from Tigray, and those were the earliest news we heard about what is happening. Survivors' account. Those were the first survivors' accounts we could hear from the war. Later, people came to Addis, especially people that had other citizenship, maybe dual citizenship. There were some Ethio-Americans, German Ethiopians, and their embassies found a way to bring them back to Addis and fly them back to their countries. And they had more stories to tell of what they had went through. But the first response we heard, the first reports we heard were from refugees in Sudan. And then later, The phone lines were accessible in a few areas in Ma'ala city and a few other cities. The connection was really bad, but we could still get a picture of what was happening. And later videos and pictures and other evidence footage started coming up. The massacre of Mai Kadra has been used to justify the war. It was the second biggest event that the federal state used to justify the war against Tigray. The first was the attack on the northern command of the ENDF, and the second one was the massacre at Mai Kadra. We still don't know who the perpetrator was. There are different claims. Some claim it was TPLF allied forces. Others claim it was the ENDF. Other claims it was the Amhara militia or the Fano Vigilante group. Regardless, there hasn't been an investigation that every group agreed on. But what we know is that there has been retaliations. Whether it was the Amharas that were killed, or whether it was the Tigrayans, we know for sure that there has been retaliation, and any other aspect of the war, including the retaliation, the different massacres. We've heard about massacres in Aksum, Maram Denglat. We've heard of massacres in quite a few number of places, the biggest so far being in Aksum, where 800 people were killed inside of a church. And none of these were reported by the state, as was Mai Kadra. It has been almost 4 months, but the Mai Kadra still occupies the news, still occupies airtime, and not the others. So the way it was used as a tool for propaganda makes one doubt the genuinity behind the reports. So I don't know. I wouldn't see it as a breakdown of the multi-ethnic federalism. I mean, there are signs of the breakdown, but not this war. I just see it as years-long hate preaching and fascism, to be honest. One of the reasons the Amhara militia and the Fano Vigilante group went to war was because they had claims over some of the lands that were occupied by Tigrayans. And that is mostly in the western part of Tigray, which we still expect were the worst hit. They were the worst affected. There was an ethnic cleansing almost. Nowadays, one barely finds any Tigrayan living in that region that was occupied by Tigrayans. The Amharas have taken over, and this was one of their causes to get into war. So I would attribute it to fascism than I would to the breakdown of the multi-ethnic federalism.
ASKARI, they lost papes, we play nice. Soldiers in the empire, violence plaguing our time. Wanna go home in a little bit of chrome by my middle, patrolling a riddle for my enemy. Feelings don't mean nothing from what I've seen in theaters of destruction, but these scenes aren't scripted. Nah, it was a con, that's why we were conscripted. If war's a theatre, we're the actors, directed by colonial captors. They took control of where my fam lives, forced us to chuck our own language in favour of theirs. What kind of slavery's air if this hell we're in? I'm seeing people bleeding, broken, don't have a reason, but for freedom we're hoping. But it's not for us. Cause after this war we will still be stuck. Our lives in exchange for another buck. Collecting their spoils when the blood is stopped. ASKARI. They lost papes, we play nice. Soldiers in the empire. Violence plaguing our times. Wanna go home in a little bit of chrome by my middle. Patrolling a riddle for my enemy. We were called upon. Pawns from across waters. Battalions transported on shores to be slaughtered from. Landmines in the first planes, tanks and automatic guns. Our bodies left out when the battle's done. No honor in the way we were abandoned. No slumber up for days while the ranking officer can't be seen like a phantom. This was his country's fight. Unaware if his country's right. Agency taken away by his country's might. One day we'll see the light, fam, it must be nice. From Eritrea to Ireland, India, Jamaica to Thailand, Finland, Brazil and Azerbaijan. Our fight will cease and we'll be rising. One day, yeah. ASKARI. They lost papes, we play nice. Soldiers in the empire. Violence plaguing our times. Wanna go home in a little bit of chrome by my middle. Patrolling a riddle for my enemy. Fella says zombie. Fellas are zombies. Fella says zombie. Fellas are zombies. Fella says zombie. Fellas are zombies. British Army ain't just man in Abercrombie. No monuments to the colonies in Fondy. Viceroy, we ain't nice boys, you're wrong. Be strongly advised against being a zombie. ASKARI. They lost papes, we play nice. Soldiers in the empire. Violence plaguing our time. Gonna go home in a little bit of chrome by my middle. Patrolling a riddle for my enemy. ASKARI. They lost tapes, we played nice. Soldiers in the empire. Violence plaguing our times. Gonna go home in a little bit of chrome by my middle. Patrolling a riddle for my enemy. Hamid Idris Awate was an Asgari. My great-grandfathers were Asgari.
This is The Final Straw, and you're hearing our conversation with Honor, a member of Horn Anarchists, based in Ethiopia, talking about the war in the Tigray region of that country.
Without clear evidences of what actually was happening on the ground, despite what the two warring parties were saying on their state-owned medias, I believe the international community was hopeful and optimistic and wanted to take Abi for his word, and that this will be a surgical operation to remove the TPLF without no further damage. But it has clearly been anything but that. If anything, this is a collective punishment on any and every ethnic Tigrayan that not only lives in Tigray but also lives outside Tigray. They've been ethnically profiled. I'm talking about people that were not in Tigray. They've been arrested, detained. They had their house searched without warrants, and they were harassed, tortured, abused on the streets by people as well as by security forces. And this collective punishment actually dates back. I would say it goes back to 2016, when ethnic Tigrayans were forced to flee their homes, the place they've been living in for years, for decades, because they were ethnic Tigrayans, and they were forced to flee and go back to Tigray. And since then, roads were blocked, inflation was really high, the road to Eritrea was also opened, so yeah, inflation was pretty high in the city. And as I mentioned before, the hate preaching, the hate speeches against ethnic Tigrayans, the labeling, they were called daytime hyenas by the prime minister. And this was something that has been building up for quite a few years. But yeah, the international community, I believe, was just being hopeful and wanted to take Abi for his word. But later, it became clear that this was not a surgical operation and that civilians were at the receiving end of this wrath from Abi. And now the international community is very alarmed and is trying to influence and pressure Abi to make sure that he at least provides access to distribute humanitarian aid and takes necessary steps to protect civilians. Not even protect, but just stop killing civilians. Now there are also threats of economic sanctions, cutting of aids, and now the international community really seems alarmed about what is happening and keeps mentioning it to Abi, although not much has changed about what he's doing. Yeah, ethnic Tigrayans were facing repression. Not only were they illegally detained, illegally searched, even arrested, they were also harassed and tortured on the streets. If they had a Tigrinya sounding name, or if their ID said that they were from the Tigrayan ethnic origin, they were also unable to board international flights, as Ethiopian Airlines was asking people to provide their local IDs to make sure what ethnic group they were from, to bar them from flying. So there were also a few indications that there was something like a concentration camp. We have not been able to verify if this was true or not, but yeah, we've definitely heard about a concentration camp as well. Many ethnic Tigrayans were getting laid off. They were being suspended from work, especially those that had government jobs. Every member of the military that is ethnic Tigrayan has been suspended. Also, members of the federal government and the organizations functioning under the federal government that were working in different parts of the country were also suspended from work because they were ethnic Tigrayans. Many landlords were also evicting people and telling them to leave their house because and only because they were ethnic Tigrayans. This had gotten so bad that Tigrayans could not even speak their language on the streets and in coffee shops or in hotels, as they were very, very alarmed and scared as to what that would result in, what hearing their language would make the state and security forces, even fascists, do.
I'm issuing a content warning that there is a graphic description of sexual assault coming up. If you're concerned, please skip ahead 2 full minutes or turn down the radio for that length of time.
We've recently been seeing that there was a footage that was circulating on social media of civilians being killed by the Ethiopian National Defense Force, being massacred in a very, very gruesome manner. One of the biggest concerns is also rape. There's widespread rape in the cities that are controlled by ANDF. Both the ANDF and the Eritrean soldiers are engaged in gang rapes of young girls, very young girls. At first it was teenagers, and then the reports coming now are of children less than the age of 13. And the reason behind what is being said is that the Eritrean soldiers were warned against HIV. So the assumption was that young girls would be free from HIV and they were safe options. So they're engaged in gang rapes of very, very young girls. And what is happening, what they're doing to these people. We recently read a report and also saw a video of this young woman that was raped, that was gang raped by 23 soldiers for 5 days. And then they stuffed some dirt and plastic bags and even nails into her vagina. And there was a video circulating of the doctors removing all the stuff that was stuffed in her. And the cruelty is unthinkable. It's inhumane.
How has the response from the international community, in your eyes, been to the conflicts in Tigray and the repression of the Tigrayan people?
So when talking about aid distribution in the region, we need to understand what is at play here. There are international aid organizations that had food, medicine, medical supplies, food supplies ready and packed, and they had truckloads of these items waiting to distribute, but could not get access to the regions. The government and the ENDF would not allow access, and that was the main difficulty into helping the people that were starving and that were dying from hunger, thirst, and lack of medicines.
While the wheels are turning in the UN to try to get some sort of intervention of peacekeeping troops, is there anything that you can think of that people from abroad can do to actually aid the people in Tigray and to send material, to get people fed?
Our critique was mainly because of the different GoFundMe accounts that were being started by warmongers that were supporting the war. And we felt like it was dishonest to collect money and aids in the name of the Tigrayan people, saying that you would distribute it to the people in Tigray when you have no means of reaching Tigray. The problem was not that there was shortage of food or shortage of medical supplies. There were aid organizations that were ready to distribute. They had truckloads of them. They just could not get access. And regardless of how much money one was collecting in the name of Tigrayans and the people of Tigray, it wouldn't matter how much money they collected, as they would not have any means to distribute it. So our critique was mainly at these dishonest attempts to try and be sympathetic towards Tigrayans by collecting aid and by organizing GoFundMes.
This is The Final Straw, and you're hearing our conversation with Honor, a member of Horn Anarchists, based in Ethiopia, talking about the war in the Tigray region of that country. Maybe people in the audience who are concerned about this similarly could look up and find, for instance, businesses like Ethiopian Airlines, if they live in a city where there is a large international airport, and maybe there is an Ethiopian Airlines stall, that could be a place to apply pressure, or any sort of diplomatic governmental buildings.
There are different ways in which the international community can show solidarity with the people of Tigray, and the most basic one is tweeting, using the hashtags, making sure that word gets out, making sure the communication and media blackouts does not mean the world does not know what is happening. We need to be as loud as possible to make sure that people are aware of what is happening. I personally believe that Tigray should be the center of the world at this moment, every eye should be looking towards Tigray because there's another genocide happening in the 21st century. And we can almost be sure that world leaders are going to come out tomorrow to say that never again, to say that they will not let this happen ever again. But this is happening right now, and we're living through it. And we can't let it happen. And especially, we can't let it happen in silence. The least we can do is raise awareness, make sure everyone knows about it, make sure our local representatives know about it, respond to it, and that they report to the people that have elected them of what they're doing to try and to stop it. There are also options in helping refugees that have been displaced, most of which are in Sudan right now. Our collective was organizing a mutual aid support with refugees that are in Sudan. There are also other initiatives trying to support refugees in Sudan, as well as those in Tigray. Access is relatively better now. We cannot say it's unfettered and it's free, but it's relatively better. And there are also initiatives to try and distribute aid in Tigray, though it remains limited. There's also the option of helping Tagaru organizers. There are different Tigrayan organizers all over the world trying to organize protests, rallies, and appealing to the United Nations and the governments of the countries in which they reside to pressure Abiy to stop the genocide, to make sure that the Eritrean army leaves Tigray, that the Amhara militias and the Fano Vigilante leave Tigray, because the atrocities they're committing are very, very unthinkable and horrendous. It's also important that people that want to stand in solidarity with Tigrayans hold their representatives accountable about the measures that their representatives and their governments are taking to pressure the Ethiopian government to stop this genocidal war and to pressure their countries and the United Nations to intervene and enact its responsibility to protect civilians. With how bad this is right now, we've heard of confirmed deaths of more than 50,000, but many places are still not accessible, and reports have not been completed in even parts that are accessible. But we expect so many casualties, and this is continuing.
At this point in the conversation, the audio quality greatly decreases, so apologies to listeners who have difficulty with it. There will be a transcript available for easy reading very soon, probably within a week. I guess this is like back to theoretical world for a second. If you were to see, like, after an end to the armed conflict, I'm sure that your collective has talked a lot about what it would be like to transition into a like decentralized grassroots anti-fascist, anti-nationalist region. And
yeah, we've been discussing it a lot, and what we were hoping was some sort of so there are different fascists in Ethiopia. It's very interesting. There are the ethno-fascists, and then there are the fascists that believe in Ethiopianism. There's the ethno-nationalist camp and the unitarist camp, and they all accuse each other of fascism. But they're all right. They're all fascist. And people, while trying to fight a certain type of fascism, they go into another type of fascism. They go into their own group. There are quite a number of different fascistic groups in the country right now that are supported, that get applauded by the government as well. So what we were hoping was if we could have, let me speak on my behalf, on my own behalf. Personally, I want to start a workers' movement. I believe it would be cross-cutting among different ethnic groups, different beliefs, as the poor people of Ethiopia know their problems best, and whoever is claiming to represent them and to fight on their behalf basically uses them as a human shield. There are quite a number of people dying in Ethiopia every day in different parts of the country from these fascist or fascist groups, and they're very loud. They're platformed. They control the media. They control their resources, and people are scared that if they do not align themselves with either this one or that one, there's no middle ground for people belonging in different groups to come together and fight against their own oppressors. One of the reasons TPLF is blamed for oppression of the country, TPLF is a minority, as I told you. They haven't been going around and repressing every ethnic group. It has been the structure. What has been the people that have been repressing and oppressing the people of Oromia were not necessarily people of TPLF. It was people that came from that group that were in power. But people still feel like, I've been oppressed because I belong to a certain ethnic group. And the only way I can fight this repression is if I align myself with people of my own ethnic group and fight against the others, which creates animosity almost with every other group except your own. And then it becomes hard to even talk about class struggle in that regard. But ideally, I would love a class movement. Class has very little significance in Ethiopian politics nowadays. It's solely based on identity, and identity specifically ethnic identity. So it's either you're a certain ethnic group or you're a fascist that believes that people should not even mention their identities and should believe in one country, one God, one people. So their struggle is really tough.
Yeah, I spoke a few years back with someone who was organizing in Bosnia, and some of the parts of this conversation remind me of parts of that conversation where he talked about the institutionalization of ethnic differentiation, and even if not in application, the institutionalization of quote-unquote self-rule and formalization of ethnic difference as being the basis on which people lived in community together. While it would protect, ostensibly it would protect someone from getting repressed by another group and allowing someone to practice their religion, speak their language, these things, it also institutionalizing it into the government and being the basis for representation of administering public monies or social programs or whatever, also led to the sort of solidified differentiation between people that after the fall of Yugoslavia, where everyone had been sort of united under this idea of class in a lot of ways, as imperfect as Tito's state was. This person that I was talking to was very excited about the possibility that people had broken out of those sort of ethnic parties that were meant to divide them against each other, and it seems like a very important and critical thing. I think that it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, there are some groups that are mobilizing to criminalize organizing based on ethnic identities. But what we've had throughout the history of Ethiopia is Ethiopia is an imperialist country. We have fought against the fascist Italy, but we have not struggled against our own fascism. And it's an expansionist state, it's an empire, and it has been assimilating people into the dominant culture. So I somehow sympathize with people that are fighting for their group rights based on their ethnic identity. They were not allowed to speak in their own language. They were not allowed to practice their own religion, as the state religion for so many years has been Orthodox Christianity. And people were sort of forced to denounce their own identity and get in line with what was considered as the state identity, which is the identity of Highlanders and Christianity. But this ethnic federalism that most Ethiopians are much against, allows nations and nationalities complete self-determination to the point of secession. So it has been a battleground for so many different political parties that have been trying to use it to sort of force and twist the arms of the federal government, not actually the regional government, but activists. They're activists from different ethnic groups that claim that they will secede if this are not fulfilled, which is what I don't see the point of, honestly. I'm not against people struggling to protect their rights as groups, especially minorities. But how long is that going? As othering is a major problem, especially nowadays when the Abi regime is trying to reconstruct the old state of one Ethiopia, where identities are sort of melted into one. Ethiopia was actually called the melting pot of identities, as in melting into a certain and dominant identity.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time and working with me to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. Just a little update on supporting the show. Thank you again so much to the people that have become Patreon supporters. We're moving forward with the transcription work. So we've got 2.5 months worth of transcribed zines that we've been able to put online for free distribution. Sent a bunch of them into some of the prisoners that I keep in touch with personally. Some of them have gotten sent back if they deal with prison issues. It's beautiful. It's working. This is great. If you haven't already and you would care to support The Final Straw, please visit our website and check out the merch link. And you can find ways there to support us monetarily, whether by one-time donation, by recurring donations, through a few different services, such as LibrePay, PayPal, or Patreon, some of which have gifts that we give back to you with. Through the Patreon, you can, for instance, if you're giving $10 or more a month, you'll get a bunch of initial gifts and then a monthly zine in the mail, and know that your money is going to the very hard work of transcribing all these conversations and getting them more widely distributed. If you want to help us out and don't have money, that's totally awesome. Tell people about us on social media, rate us on the podcasting platforms, tell people, download the zines and send them into prisoners, or leave them at bus stops or at laundromats or whatever, gas stations. You could also contact a local community radio station and let them know that we want to be aired. There's information about all this and more in the show notes, as well as up at our website. But yeah, thank you again to all the people that are giving us support. Also, just throwing out, we still have a bunch of benefit t-shirts for Fire Ant Journal that were designed by Michael Kimball and that go to benefit him. You can find those at our Big Cartel, which is thefinalstrawradio.bigcartel.com. Again, linked from our website also. Thanks. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.